This is Typo Negative, Brooklyn, New York. Yo, Brooklyn! And we'd like to wish you a happy Halloween. Enjoy block number 1 because we don't.
One of the biggest alternative music trends of the past few years is the rise of the goth aesthetic in metal. For example, all the goth baddies on TikTok, the whole big titty goth GF trend. And if you ask me, the band that started all of that is Typo Negative. Coming out of the New York hardcore scene, they pioneered the fusion of goth and metal back when that was almost unheard of with their first few albums. And eventually they took that way past the metal underground and brought it to the mainstream when they broke out on MTV with Black Number 1, which introduced millions of people to the genre and that aesthetic. And unfortunately, their potential was cut short when Pete Steele tragically died in 2010, but their influence has been huge. If shoegaze and goth are two of the biggest trends in modern metal, I don't think we'd have a lot of that without Typo Negative. So how did Typo Negative go from grimy Brooklyn hardcore shows to the top of MTV and Rolling Stone? And what is their lasting impact and influence? Those are the questions that I will answer in this video. With the playoffs heating up, now is the perfect time to get in on the action with my partners at DraftKings Sportsbook. Right now, all new customers who bet just $5 on anything will get $150 in bonus bets instantly. So what are you waiting for? Download the DraftKings app now and sign up using my promo code PUNKROCK. The crown is yours. That's right, new customers can bet just $5 on absolutely anything and receive $150 in bonus bets instantly. And DraftKings has something for returning customers as well. They can score a no-sweat NBA bet. And if sports betting is not yet available in your state, don't worry. You can still join in on all the fun with DraftKings Daily Fantasy and have a shot to win cash prizes. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now. New customers use my promo code PUNKROCK and bet just $5 on any wager and get $150 in bonus bets instantly. That's promo code PUNKROCK only at DraftKings Sportsbook. The roots of Typo Negative actually go back to 1985 with a band called Carnivore, which was co-founded by Typo Negative bassist and vocalist Pete Steele. And Carnivore was a very interesting band. Musically, they could best be described as crossover, meaning a combination of hardcore and metal that fit in with a lot of the other bands at the time like Cro-Mags, DRI, Agnostic Front, Crumbsuckers, and all that stuff. But they had a very different image than any of the other crossover bands. They dressed up in these homemade costumes that made them look sort of like extras from Mad Max. And aside from their image, what also really stood out from a lot of other bands in the genre at the time was their lyrics, which were, let's just say, a little edgy. In my opinion, it's pretty obvious that these lyrics were tongue-in-cheek, but still, they were definitely not exactly politically correct. For example, songs like Jesus Hitler and maybe their most notorious song, Race War. And if you heard that song and you thought to yourself, wow, that sounds a lot like early Typo Negative, well, then you'd be right. Carnivore broke up in 1987, Pete Steele formed a new band called Typo Negative, and the songs that he had already written for Carnivore became Typo Negative's first album, Slow, Deep, and Hard, in 1991, which largely did sound like Carnivore with the addition of some kind of doomy, gothy elements added. One of the early Typo Negative songs was especially Carnivore-like, called Der Untermensch, which means the subhumans in German, and was about people who, at least in their view, were taking advantage of the welfare system.
Hey you, on public assistance, why don't you get a job? Sell some soap and buy some bride.
This got them in a little bit of hot water because there were some people, especially in Europe, who took the song as an endorsement of Nazis, who I guess also used that term. Although to me, it's pretty clear that that's not how the band meant it. As their guitarist Josh Silver said, they just invented a bunch of shit and said we were Nazis. As a Jew, I obviously never want to be labeled as a Nazi, but at the same time, go ahead and make us famous. That's fine. Again, it's pretty clear to me that this song was tongue-in-cheek, like so many of Pete's lyrics in general, but I also think that in this case, it was at least somewhat sincere, because it's very similar to another song that he wrote around the same time, Public Assistance by Agnostic Front. With that being said, do I think Pete Steele is a genuinely hateful, awful person? Well, we're going to talk about that later, so stick around for that. They followed up Slow, Deep, and Hard with their second album, Origin of the Feces, which is kind of a weird album. For one, it was marketed as a live album, but it's not actually live at all. It was recorded in the studio, and all the crowd noises and the banter and all that were added afterwards to make it sound live. And most of the songs are also re-recorded, retitled versions of the songs from their first album. And I always kind of wondered why they did that, because it's a really strange thing to do for your second album, and I finally found out. Here's what Monty Connor said, who was their legendary A&R at Roadrunner. Peter was the kind of guy that was never happy with the final result. Basically, when Slow, Deep, and Hard came out and Peter started touring for that record, in his mind he had already moved ahead and he had revised and changed the songs. Origin of the Feces was his way of fixing that album to the way he heard it in his head. And listening to these two albums now, you can definitely hear the seeds of what Type O Negative was about to become. And personally, I think Slow, Deep, and Hard is great, although neither album was particularly successful, even like on an underground level, but that was about to change. Type O Negative released their third album, Bloody Kisses, in 1993, which is when they really became Type O Negative. It was still heavy and sludgy like their earlier stuff, but it was much more than just that. Really, it was something entirely different that we'd never really heard before. Pete Steele described it this way.
What do we sound like? We sound like Black Sabbath meets the Beatles rehearsing Drunk on a Haunted Factory.
Which kind of sounds crazy, but actually I think that's exactly the right way to put it. It was crushing and dark, but with these just genuinely great songs that had a very clear pop sensibility, despite being so dark and brooding and twisted. It was, I guess you could say, like gothic pop metal, which nobody had done before, and it was obviously brilliant. As Monty Connor said, quote, "It's a masterpiece. It's more than a record. It feels like a work of art." And I'm inclined to agree with Monty on that. And there were still some traces of their New York hardcore past with songs like Kill All the White People, which could have easily been a Carnivore song, complete with the edgy, very un-PC lyrics. And despite having what everybody agreed was an absolutely incredible album on their hands, the band still wasn't very active, largely because Pete just didn't want to tour. Instead, he wanted to keep his day job working for the New York City Parks Department, and it actually wasn't even clear that the band was going to stay together and continue to even be a band. Eventually, Pete was persuaded to get out and do some touring, first with Life of Agony, but the band still wasn't really taking off commercially. But still, the right people were noticing what Type O Negative was doing. First, Nine Inch Nails offered them a tour, then of all bands, Motley Crue, which surprisingly ended up being the thing that turned their whole career around.
Motley Crue asked you to go out. You were like, what are you, crazy?
How is this gonna work?
At us. How are we gonna be? No way, no way. He says, do it.
It'll be good for you guys. You guys should definitely do it.
And that's it.
Reluctantly, we did, and that's what put us on the map.
Yeah, we went from selling 50 albums a week to selling 2,000 albums a week. I'm like, in 1 week.
And from there, everything started to snowball. First, the band was picked up by MTV, especially the song Black No. 1, which was all over Headbangers Ball and Beavis and Butthead, when that show was at its absolute cultural peak as a hit-making force.
You guys aren't gonna get any chicks looking like this. Yes, they will, dumbass.
And speaking of which, I think the video itself also had a lot to do with their breakthrough. It was just so unique, and with Pete being this like literal larger than life figure, I think he was like 6'7", playing that double bass like it's a guitar, and to go back to their connections again with the New York hardcore scene, the video was actually directed by Paris Mayhew from Cro-Mags. And aside from that, their aesthetic in general is just really striking, with everything being green and black. It was a really bold look that wasn't really like anything else at the time. Like if you look at it now, it feels like it could come out tomorrow and it would still look contemporary. I think that really helped them stand out a lot, to the point where you sort of wondered if they had some sort of like slick marketing team behind them. But really, it was just Pete. As Monty Connor said, it had to be the right green. He would come into the office or sit down with the art director and look at these color-coded PMS books that designers use. Pete would literally spend hours looking through hundreds of different shades of green until he found the one that he wanted. And eventually, all of that came together and Type O Negative had officially broken through. Bloody Kisses became Roadrunner's very first gold album and really put them on the map as something bigger than just an underground metal label. Because remember, this was years before Slipknot and Nickelback and all the other bands that made Roadrunner into what they are now. Before this, they were really just known as like an underground death metal label. Pete also became something close to like a mainstream alternative celebrity with his infamous Playgirl centerfold, which obviously I can't show you here, but let's just say it was very impressive, and his appearance on Jerry Springer at the absolute peak of relevance for daytime talk shows.
Hi, Peter.
Yes.
You happy to be here?
I'm less miserable.
And after some extensive touring, they followed that up in 1996 with October Rust, which basically followed in the footsteps of Bloody Kisses, taking things even more in the direction of pop goth, and mostly leaving behind the doom metal and hardcore elements of their earlier albums. Like the main single, My Girlfriend's Girlfriend, always kind of reminded me of something like the goth version of The Doors. It also featured a cover of Cinnamon Girl by Neil Young, which, just like their cover of Summer Breeze earlier, they really completely transformed into their own song. In fact, I actually had no idea for years that that was even a cover. And depending on who you ask, this may be considered Type O Negative's best album. Personally, I consider all three of their albums to be classics for different reasons, so really you could pick any of them, and to me that would be a good choice. Like Slow, Deep, and Hard is really the perfection of that Carnivore style. Bloody Kisses to me is the perfection of gothic metal. And October Rust is the perfection of, I guess you could say, like gothic pop metal. I think personally they are all incredible, so it's really just a question of which flavor you personally prefer. And one thing I also really appreciate is that even though they stopped doing the kind of silly hardcore songs with this album, and although they obviously took the craft of making music very seriously, they didn't take themselves seriously, unlike a lot of other goth stuff, which to me felt like oftentimes very pretentious. For example, the outro to October Rust.
Well, that's about it. That's all we have. I hope it wasn't too disappointing. We will see you on tour. Until then, take it easy.
And they followed that up in 1999 with World Coming Down, which took a much darker turn. And obviously all their music is dark, but this was like dark, dark. For example, the first song on the album called White Slavery, which is about Pete's growing problem with cocaine. And this wasn't some sort of like abstract warning message designed to scare you straight or whatever. This is what they were actually living day to day. As Peter said about the song White Slavery, the worst part is when you're coming down from it. It's 5 in the morning and there's no one to talk to. You're on a tour bus doing 80 miles an hour and you look out the window and it looks like you're on Mars. All I could think about was jumping out of the bus while it was moving. And I have had those 5 a.m. cocaine come downs myself. And I can tell you from personal experience, I get it. It definitely does give you that feeling of just wanting to die. It's awful. And that entire feeling really comes through on this whole album. For example, it also has 3 tracks called Sinus, Liver, and Lung, each of which were about the various organs that the band members were destroying with their drug and alcohol use. Like I said, it's dark. Personally, I think it's really well done, but it's not something I would choose to listen to because it's really such a bummer and it takes me back to a time in my life that I really just don't want to relive. And I think the band kind of felt that way about it too. And after 4 years, they came back with Life is Killing Me in 2003, which I consider to be kind of a return to form. To me, this sounds a lot closer to Bloody Kisses and October Rust, especially the lead single, I Don't Want to Be Me, which is my personal favorite Type O Negative song. There's also I Like Goyles, which kind of brings back a Carnivore type of vibe, including, again, some very un-PC lyrics. And all in all, I consider this to be one of their absolute best albums, and pretty underrated by Type O Negative fans who mostly seem to not really like it that much. But what comes across to me more than anything else on this album is a really profound sense of sadness. For example, I Don't Want to Be Me. Like, I don't think that is tongue-in-cheek like a lot of their other songs. I think that's literally how he felt at the time. I think he genuinely just did not like who he was. As another example of that, I found an interview with Pete from around when the album came out, where you get the sense that he has some very real regrets about the direction his life has taken, especially considering that he always seemed to have sort of a love-hate relationship with the idea of being the frontman of a touring band. I wish I could find someone to spend the rest of my life with, and I'd like to have kids, but I'm not going to rush into either one of those things simply because I don't think a father's occupation should be rock and roller. You really just get the sense that he's looking in the mirror and wondering, like, did I fuck everything up? Is it too late? Was I meant to maybe just keep working at the parks department and be a normal stay-at-home dad? And to be honest, honest, I think the answer to that might have been yes. As he talks about in that quote, I'm not sure that this life was really best for him.
I just went a little bit too out of control, I think, with substances. I was trying to compensate for my father's death and being a coward by hiding behind chemicals, and it caught up with me.
And they followed up Life Is Killing Me with what would end up being their final album, Dead Again, in 2007. And this album, once again, is very, very dark, which is a product of the circumstances around it. Pete had become basically a recluse, his drug problem was getting really, really out of control, and he was eventually involuntarily committed by his family members.
I'm going to jail. Well, I mean, you know, I went from playing in bars to playing behind bars. So now I have the gold, platinum, and criminal records. It works well.
And as you would expect, it's an incredibly dark album. I personally can't even listen to it because I feel like I'm listening to a suicide note. And the reason I say that is because Pete Steele died in 2010 of heart failure, and that was the end of Type O Negative.
And since I've been sober now about 6 months, I'm starting to like feel things again.
Which brings us to the last few questions about their legacy and influence. The first one, which a lot of people seem to be asking these days, is, well, was Pete Steele a horrible person? This seems to be based mostly on the lyrics that I mentioned before about people on welfare and Carnivore songs like Race War. There's also a song on their last album called These Three Things, which is very clearly anti-abortion.
An unborn child should not have to, pay the price because you were too lazy to go to the pharmacy to get a condom.
And obviously you're entitled to your opinion about any of those things, and I don't know anybody in the band, so I have no personal knowledge, but here is my take. First of all, Pete Steele was obviously a guy who liked to make jokes and say these kind of like edgy, tongue-in-cheek things to get a laugh out of people or to piss off people who he perceived as being uptight. So I think a lot of what he was saying was really just talking shit in the same way as South Park would do a few years later. And second, let's also consider the context. Remember, he grew up in a version of New York City that hasn't existed for a long time. New York, and I think especially Brooklyn, was not a friendly, easy place to live in the 70s and 80s. And for better or worse, there was a lot of like very genuine racial tension and violence.
Two views as police distributed a sketch of the white man sought for the shooting last Saturday afternoon of 4 black male teenagers who allegedly tried to rob him.
So when I look at a song like Race War, which came out only a few years after the subway shootings they mentioned in that clip, I don't think he's saying we should have a race war. I think he's saying we are in the middle of a race war whether you like it or not. And to further contextualize that, I want to go back to their roots in the hardcore scene, because this is the same kind of attitude that you see from a lot of New York City hardcore bands of that era, like Agnostic Front, Cro-Mags, Marauder, and so forth. These guys were basically wild animals because they grew up in what was essentially like an urban war zone, where just going to school, taking the subway somewhere, literally you were risking your physical safety or your life every single time. Ask anybody who grew up in New York back then, and they will pretty much universally tell you like, wow, that was a fucked up place. I can't believe I made it out of that. So if you grow up in that, you're probably not going to be the most chill person. I think for understandable reasons. And when I see a lot of people on TikTok trying to cancel him because he's not sufficiently woke, that to me just seems like kind of a naive, foolish point of view to me.
Well, you can call it what you want, but, I come from a background where I feel that the average person, normal people, work for a living.
I mean, think about it this way. He was born in Brooklyn in 1962. What would make you think that a Russian guy from Brooklyn who grew up in the 70s would be progressive by modern day standards? Like, that's just kind of a crazy thing to think. It's like when people are shocked that Tom Araya from Slayer, who is a 62-year-old man from Chile, and they're surprised that he's a pro-life Catholic. To me, it just sort of shows that these kids on TikTok don't really know anything about the world if they think that a guy like him is likely to be progressive by 2024 standards. And so overall, my take on Pete Steele is that he was an incredibly talented person who, like a lot of really brilliant people, was also haunted by a lot of demons. As he said himself, quote, "I've always been a very insecure person and I've always wanted to be liked. I found that one way to do that was to make people laugh, even if it was at the expense of myself. If they weren't laughing with me, okay. If they want to laugh at me, it's better than nothing."
When I had found out that the Bloody Kisses went gold, I'm like, this is like a nation of deaf people. I'm like, I didn't take the band seriously. I mean, we would call ourselves assholes before you did, but we really meant it. And I would come in and say, I can't believe you fucking jerk-offs are actually paying to fucking see this.
And I get the sense that he really genuinely didn't like himself very much. I don't think this was an act. I don't think he was being falsely humble. I think that sense of self-loathing in their their lyrics was very genuine, which was something you see in a lot of people with a really serious addiction problem. It seems to me that although he obviously took the craft of songwriting very seriously, and I think he also had a lot of genuinely profound, deep things to say, I don't think he ever took himself seriously at all. And so overall, when I take a look at Type O Negative, to me, more than anything else, it's unfortunate that we lost him when we did, because I would have loved to see how his thinking and music evolved over time, but sadly, we'll never know. And so I hope that in death, he found the peace that he could never find in life. All right, my friends, that does it for this video. As always, let me know what you think in the comments. And also, I want to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon, especially those of you who support at the True Cult level or above. Patrons get all my videos early. I do giveaways and Q&As sometimes. And there's also a way to have me review your music. So if any of that sounds cool, hit the link in the description of this video. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.